Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Got a Case of Wanderlust podcast. I'm your host, Lydia, and today I'm with special guest Sivan. And Sivan advocates for responsible and cultural travel, as well as imperfect sustainability and vegan friendly foods. I am super excited to dive into this meaningful travel conversation all about sustainability and responsible tourism with Sivan today. So, with that, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here.
I am too. First of all, I want to say that your travel content on social media, specifically, I was stalking your Instagram page, is full of such good tidbits and tips and advice for how we could just be better travelers. So, thank you for creating this content, and I'm excited to just spotlight some of your advice today.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. That's really nice of you to say.
My first question, though, is what sparked your wanderlust?
Ooh, that's a good one. Um, well, to be honest, I only started traveling like quite late in life. I'd say probably like, well, properly traveling like without my family, like probably in my mid 20s. And I think the thing was that I was always like so focused on like my career. So basically, so I'm a cancer biologist, and basically I went from like my undergrad to my PhD straight to a career, like straight after, without even like taking like a bit of a break to travel or anything. And then at some point, I was just like, I kind of want to like take it a bit slower and just not maybe just focus on my career all the time. Obviously, that's important, but I wanted to see more of the world, I guess. But the thing is that a lot of my friends, especially at that point, were like already married or settled down with kids, whereas I was still single and no one really wanted to travel with me. So I kind of just decided to travel solo. And most of my travels are actually solo. And I think my biggest trip, which really like started this whole like my whole passion of travel, was so back in 2019, I had a pretty serious operation on my back, and there was like a chance that I wouldn't be able to walk again. That I would have to like have a catheter at like the age of 33, which is obviously quite like a scary and daunting thing. So after I managed to, after 6 weeks of like in recovery and a bit more time with physio, I decided that I wanted to get out into the world again, and that was like my first like big solo trip. So I went around Southeast Asia for about a month, and I'd also just been fired from like a previous job as well. So honestly, it was like the worst time in my life, I think, in 2019. And then I just decided to travel, and then I was there for like a month, and honestly, I just like I guess I got the travel bug at that point, because I just find it so fascinating to like meet people from like different ways of life, learn about their culture. That's kind of what drives my passion for travel. It's all about learning about different cultures, religions, traditions, things like that. Not also like having a break and like going on a holiday, but for me, that's like less important when it comes to travel. It's more about the cultural aspect. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, definitely for me as well. I love that. And go you for being like experiencing all that and then deciding to take a solo trip for 1 month. Your first time in Southeast Asia, like that is some boss girl moves there. And I'm
Thank
glad
you.
that it has only fueled your love for traveling solo. Um, Before we start talking about kind of sustainable, responsible tourism, I thought it would be important to define what that kind of tourism means to you.
Mhm. So in terms of sustainable travel, well, first I want to say that like it can mean something different to like everybody, and also that there's no way of being perfect. I feel like a lot of people find sustainability quite like a daunting concept because they think that they have to do everything perfectly, but unfortunately, well, it's just not feasible like in the world that we live in. So for me, sustainable travel or imperfect sustainable travel, so for example, I do admit that I fly a fair bit because for me, to be completely honest, not being able to travel and to travel like to different continents would be like a deal breaker for me. However, I kind of offset that in other ways. So for example, like I'm vegan, I don't own a car. When I travel, I take public transport everywhere. I try not to fly within Europe because we've got such a great train system. So sustainable travel though is not only to do with like your impact on the environment, it's also to do about your social and your economic impacts. So for example, how you invest your money or what you spend your money on your travels. So supporting local businesses and things like that to me that's like hugely important, and it's like a way to like minimize your impact on your travel. So for me, sustainable travel is everything that I can do that's like feasible to me, wherever it be, like traveling overland when I can, staying at local guest houses or homestays or sustainable hotels. Like, for example, I try not to use plastic bottled water. I have a filtered water bottle that I use. I try and use like zero waste products. Like, for example, my toiletries are all zero waste, things like that. So for me, yeah, that's kind of like what it means to me personally.
Yeah, I love how you focus on like really actionable, even if it's small steps that we could take to just do our part to be better travelers, because it is really so important. Such a privilege to travel, so to use that in a way that benefits the destination we're visiting as much as possible is super important. You mentioned sustainable travel is like kind of the umbrella term for traveling better, but I know there's other terms as well, like ethical tourism, responsible travel. Sometimes I use the term like mindful tourism. Do you think that these are all the same, or should we not be using these interchangeably? Like, do you think they're
That's
different?
a really good
Yeah.
question. I think probably the aim is the same in all terms of the words that you just used. I think everyone's aim is the same, and that's to kind of like minimize their impact when they travel, or to try and leave like a positive impact on the places you travel. So I think they're kind of interchangeable. I guess sustainability maybe in some parts does kind of people tend to focus on the environmental aspect. So I use responsible travel because I feel like it's maybe less daunting to people, because I think it's important to be sustainable, but it's also very important to be responsible too, in the sense that for example, when I go travel to a new country that I've never been to, I'll always read up like about the customs, the religion, the culture, to make sure that I'm dressed appropriately, that I don't do anything that can like come across as rude or disrespectful. And like obviously leaving no trace, things like that, which I think are fundamental to responsible travel. Um, I guess there's another term at the moment, which is like positive impact or regenerative travel, which is maybe is slightly different to sustainable travel, in the sense that whereas in sustainable travel you're trying to minimize your impact, regenerative travel or positive impact travel is when you're actually trying to leave a positive impact on the places that you've been to, whether that be environmental conservation, whether it be cultural preservation, things like that. So I think that's like a whole new part of like the travel world that I've been really interested in recently, because I think with the world at the moment, with there being over tourism in like many places around the world, especially here in Europe, for example, I think that regenerative travel is basically one of the only ways to try and thwart that in a way. So yeah, I think they're kind of interchangeable, but I guess like each one of the words that you use maybe has slightly different details or connotations, but the overall aim is the same. And to me, that's what's most important, that people have good intentions, that they don't just want to go somewhere and like just go there just for the sake of like leaving their home or like having a holiday. It's actually being aware of the impact that you being in someone else's country or someone else's home, because you're at the end of the day, you're a visitor in someone else's home. I think that's, to me, is the most important, is to having that intention.
Right, 100%. And before we dive into like ways we could practice regenerative tourism and sustainable tourism, now that we've kind of differentiated the two, was there a specific trip or experience that made you more invested in becoming a better traveler, like wanting to start your Instagram page around this topic?
That's a really good question, actually. So I've kind of like, it's like developed over time, to be honest. Like when I first started traveling, that maybe wasn't like, I wasn't fully aware of what sustainable or responsible travel meant. In terms of a trip, I guess it probably was that Southeast Asia trip, because at that time, so I wasn't although I was traveling solo, I traveled in a group with a company called G Adventures. And G Adventures are very much a sustainable travel company, in the sense that they take you to stay in like some homestays or locally owned guest houses. So, and that trip, I got a lot of like, had a lot of like great cultural experiences. And I feel like that it was during that trip that I realized that like not only was it like super interesting to have it, but you can like it just felt good to like be able to know that my money was going to like support like a local person or a local community. And I really love the whole cultural exchange aspect because I think it's beneficial both ways. So yeah, I think that trip just really like made me realize yeah, just how important it was to support the local community as much as possible on my travels. And I really enjoyed it as well. Yeah, and I suppose like learning more about climate change and things like that and watching documentaries and things like that, that was around the time that I decided to go vegan as well. So kind of like came hand in hand, basically.
Yeah, I feel like with anything in life, the more you do something, the more you spend time
Exactly.
participating, you realize the more nuances there are, the more kind of like cracks there are in the picture perfect thing that you started out or that you first envisioned it to be. Um, I really want to dive deeper into supporting local because that is one of the biggest things, as you mentioned, about sustainable travel as well as regenerative travel. Everyone's always talking about supporting local businesses, but can you explain why it's actually important to support local?
Yeah, sure. So, for example, like when you go on your holidays, I know that a lot of people like maybe feel more secure or at ease, like staying at like hotel chains, like I don't know, the Hilton, etc., things like that. But I guess what you have to realize is that when you're staying at these places, your money is going to some billionaire's back pocket. Unfortunately, it's not going to support the local community or the local economy. Um, and that's where like over tourism becomes a problem, right? Because if you're trying to, the whole reason that countries want you to come and visit them is for you to invest money or to spend money in their country. um, and for example, Airbnb is another, like Airbnbs I'm sure started with like the best of intentions, but I think that most people don't realize that it can be quite damaging, especially nowadays. So for example, in places like Barcelona, which is a really great example where over tourism is obviously having a huge impact on the locals living there. But the problem with Airbnb is that because these owners see that they can make much more money from like tourists coming over, especially over in the summer months, they will up the prices and they will specifically aim their apartments or their houses to tourists, which means that then locals are priced out. And unfortunately, in Barcelona, a lot of locals have had to like leave like their hometown because they can just no longer afford it. So, and again, I don't think people have these intentions when they stay at Airbnbs or chain hotels, but I think when you start thinking about that and you realize, God, do I really want to do that to the local people living there? And so the reason why it's so important is so basically the only way that you can support the local community is like again it, like where you spend your money has a huge impact, right? So what I try and do on my travels is, and what I'd recommend if possible for people to do is to, for example, you can stay, rather than staying at like a large chain hotel, you can stay at like a local guest house that is owned by a local family. And then you know exactly where your money is going towards. Like you know that it's not going like internationally to someone who doesn't even live in that country. And and honestly, it's so beneficial because in these guest houses, you can have like, you learn so much about the culture and the people's day-to-day lives. You can even learn a bit of the language. And honestly, I find that like, I find that so beneficial to me as well. And I just enjoyed that so much. So I'd say guest houses is a big one, or I love homestays, for example, as well. So that's slightly different than a guest house in the sense that you stay in someone's home rather than like a B&B. I know that not everyone is comfortable to do that. So maybe guest houses would be like your first port of call, but not just in terms of accommodation, like even where you eat, like if you try and like, rather than going to like, let's say a McDonald's when you travel, like if you try some of the local food, which is honestly more sustainable as well because the produce is usually local, it's usually seasonal. And again, choosing where you eat or where you stay, that will honestly just help the local economy so much more. And honestly, as I said, I think it's beneficial both to the local economy and the local community, but also to you yourself. I hope that was clear.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. You definitely want to make sure your dollars stay, or whatever local currency stays there and not like somewhere far away, a foreign company in like the US or some country that doesn't need it, that doesn't actually contribute back to the destination. Can you talk more about homestays or even guest houses? Like, how do you find them and how do you make sure they're actually run by locals?
That's a really good question. So it's actually a question I get a lot, and I have a reel about it on my Instagram as well because I got so many people asking me this. So a lot of the time, honestly, I just do a lot of research by Googling like homestay in the place that I'm going to, and that's one way. But then there's also like different platforms that you can use. So for example, I recently started using a platform called homestay.com. And that is specifically just local people like renting out like their room in their house. So it's kind of like Airbnb, except in this sense, whereas Airbnb does allow like companies who own like several properties on their platform. Homestay.com does not allow that. So that's a good one. If you do want to use Airbnb, because I know some people feel comfortable because it's a very well-known like platform, just make sure that you're like if you do choose an Airbnb, it's better to have the host there because then you know you're not taking away someone's flat from them or you're taking accommodation away from someone. So that's the second one. There's other platforms called Social B&B and Fairbnb, which are like a more ethical alternative to Airbnb. And again, that will always almost be either like some sort of, you can find sustainable hotels and stuff there as well, but quite often it's just locals, again, renting out rooms, but it also has like your money goes towards a certain social impact project as well, which feeds into the regenerative travel aspect. And a lot of it is also just word of mouth. So I know a lot of people who've been to homestays and I can just read blogs and people tell you where they've stayed at. Yeah, same for guest houses, really. You can use all of the platforms that I mentioned. You can use booking.com as well because they do still have homestays and guest houses on there. In terms of finding if they're actually local or not, I just tend to go on their website if they have one or on their Instagram page, and you can kind of figure out if it's like family run or not. And most of the time these places will specifically say family run or locally run because they know that that's what some people like look out for. And in terms of a homestay, you just need to make sure that the host is actually living there because in places like India, the homestay term is used so much and they know that people look out for it. So sometimes like some B&Bs or hotels will call themselves homestays when they're not. So the homestay has to actually have the family living on site. That's the difference between a guest house and a homestay.
Okay, I'm definitely taking my own notes for my future travels. And then as far as like more unconventional tips or advice you would share for travelers wanting to be more sustainable and responsible, like can you think of anything that you haven't already mentioned? Because you've already shared so much.
So I would say, for example, one other thing is in terms of sustainable travel would be to maybe consider traveling to either to places that are maybe a little bit off the tourist trail rather than somewhere that's like people visit very often and that you know or that you have a feeling have like an issue with over tourism, like unfortunately a lot that's in Europe, which is what is going on at the moment. So I try and choose destinations that are a little maybe offbeat. And honestly, I love that because I feel like those places that are slightly less tainted, I guess, by tourism. And I've had such incredible experiences, for example, in Uzbekistan, Nepal, places like that. And next year I'm going to Malawi, Rwanda, Madagascar. And these places like really need your money and they really need tourism as well. So I think maybe consider, even if you go to a place that's really well known, like to Spain, you can go to certain cities that are maybe a little bit less off the tourist trail, like rather than visiting Barcelona, go to Toledo or something like that, just somewhere that maybe fewer people go to. Or if you do really, and I understand that some people like Paris, everyone wants to go to Paris, and I can totally understand why, like maybe consider traveling off seasons, so not like in peak season, because again, that's when tourism can unfortunately become problematic because it's more difficult, I guess, for the local community to control that. Apart from that, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of positive impact travel, which I think maybe some people don't consider, like instead of like if you want to leave a positive impact on your travel, like for example, you can do something like volunteering. So there's platforms like Worldpackers and Workaway, which again, you can, for example, volunteer at homestays, which is what I did in Vietnam just a few weeks ago. So I volunteered at a homestay and I made like content for their Instagram page to try and increase their visibility. Or for example, if you want to do a beach cleanup. So for example, I've joined several beach cleanups or cleanup events on my travels. Again, that's just a way for you to like help benefit. So you being there can actually be a benefit to the local community. So I think volunteering is a big one, but if you don't have enough time to do that, there's several different like social impact projects that you can find. For example, there's like cafes that will hire people of disabilities or people who have like, who are less fortunate or have like street children. So in places like, especially in Asia, there's a lot of these types of restaurants or cafes that you can visit. So there's one in Hanoi, for example, which is called Cut Save Vegan, and it's run by a former street child. And most of the proceeds go towards helping local families and helping street children. So again, just by you just eating there or just by you going there can have a huge benefit on the local community. So even just things like that, where it just doesn't even mean that you have to change like the way that you travel. It's simply just by going to a specific place to eat or to drink. Even that can make a difference. And yeah, in terms of more sustainable, like environmental impact, again, if you can avoid flying where you can, obviously, as I said, I still fly a fair bit. Once I get to my destination, I try and travel by public transport. I think that's also a big one. It's a great way to learn to meet locals and to learn about the culture as well. It's more affordable. Of course, not every country has a very good public transport system or train system. We're very lucky in Europe. But yeah, so I'd say all those things. And again, you don't have to do all of them, even if you take it one step at a time. Just consider those small little changes. And honestly, in the long run, it has a huge impact.
Yes, I love that you point out it doesn't have to be this complicated thing to like travel, to be a responsible tourist, to be a sustainable tourist. It really is just being more mindful, making a little smarter choices that doesn't have to require so much more effort or research on your part. And it really does feel so much better when you're traveling to these places that actually need tourism dollars. Like you're so much more, at least in my experience, when I've traveled to places that aren't super like over touristed, the locals are so much more welcoming. You feel like you actually can, like, I don't know, belong there rather than like somewhere like Paris where you're like, like I don't know if I am necessarily like being received as nicely as I feel like
Honestly,
I should be.
I
Yeah.
I totally get that. Like in Barcelona, for example, when they were protesting, locals are protesting and like using water guns to like spray on people like tourists because they just didn't want the tourists there. Obviously, that's like maybe that was a bit of an extreme way of doing it, but it just shows you like how fed up these locals are with tourists. So clearly there is an issue. And again, I do want to say though, and I didn't mention before, although there is a lot of like we should try and do better. Obviously, it's down to the governments as well to try and put in some sort of restrictions or to improve things. But obviously, unfortunately, that very rarely happens, or it takes years for that to be put in place. So if we can do something to just make the locals' lives like a little bit easier, and again, as you said, it'll make you feel so much better because the people are like so friendly and welcoming. Like when I went to Sri Lanka, and I went during their economic crisis, so they had like almost no tourists. Honestly, they were just so grateful, and it was just and again, I'm not trying to be like have some like white savior thing or anything like that. It's also just I felt like it was very beneficial to me, not just to them. It can make, yeah, I just think that tourism can be a force for good as long as you do it in the right way. And you just, like you said, it's all about being mindful and thinking, okay, I'm a visitor in someone else's home. How would I want people to act in like my home or in my home country? You just have to think about it in that same way. And I think that's the biggest place. That's how you can start. Just having that mindset can already make a huge difference, I think.
Yeah, yeah, it just starts with that simple consciousness. Well, that was a wealth of information. Thank you so much, Sivan. And just to wrap up, I have a few like rapid fire questions I always like to end with. So the first is, what is your dream destination at the moment?
Ooh, that's a good one. So some that I have very like high up on my list are like Ecuador and Nicaragua. They're probably the two highest on my list at the moment. But also Armenia and Georgia, very high up there as well. Yeah, lots of places. It's really hard for me to pick, but those are probably the first. I don't think I'll be able to go this year, but next year, but maybe the year after. We'll see.
It sounds like you have incredible trips already to look forward to.
I'm excited, yes. Looking forward to it.
And then, secondly, what is a memorable meal that you've had during your travels?
Ooh. Um, so I love traveling for food. I have to say I'm a big foodie.
Same.
And I love finding like so I'm vegan obviously, which can be sometimes a bit difficult to travel, but I love finding like like dishes that are either traditionally vegan, just like accidentally vegan. But I guess the one that's like comes to mind most right now is, as I mentioned earlier, I was volunteering at a homestay in northern Vietnam in like this local tribe called the Red Sao tribe. And we basically like they grow everything in like their garden or they just forage from like the jungle. So we literally had like just harvested something like some vegetables and we just cooked it. Like I've never had like a meal that I think that I worked like harder towards, or it just makes you like realize like how important food is, or also just because here like with the convenience you just go to the supermarket and you buy something, it's like it's not the same. So I think that had like a really profound impact on me to watch that, but also it just tasted really really good because the tribe were not vegan themselves, but they were really really welcoming and just made me like vegan dishes. And I just thought, and we all ate together like as a family, sat on the floor, and it was, yeah, that's probably definitely my most memorable meal I think so far.
That is so cute. No, it definitely makes you realize how much goes into the food we eat every single day that we may take for granted. But when you actually work for it, it's like every bite tastes so much better. I agree.
So, yeah.
And then lastly, what is a special place in your heart?
So I have, it's like asking me, like a lot of people ask me what my favorite country is, and I find that so hard to pick. But for example, I really loved Colombia. So I went there in August this year. And it's just like, it's such a beautiful place, like in terms of nature, but also the cities are just amazing and fascinating. And I think what I love about it as well is that they had like such a dark history, and yet the people are like some of the warmest, like loveliest people I've ever met. And you can still go there and find places where there's like not many tourists. Yeah, there's a place called Jardín in Colombia in the coffee region, which is probably one of my favorite places on earth because it's a cute little town of like colorful houses, rolling green hills, waterfalls. Yeah, so probably Colombia, but I also love many other places, but that one has a particularly warm place in my heart, and I'd love to go back one day.
I've heard Colombia has some of the world's highest biodiversity, like
Yeah,
in
it
such a
does.
small amount of land space. So it sounds incredible.
Stunning.
Amazing. Well, with that, Sivan, where can we find you?
So you can find me on Sivan_travels green, which is my Instagram account. I try and post as often as I can. So about twice a week at the moment, because I also have a full-time job. And yeah, on there I post all things positive impact travel, responsible travel, sustainable travel, things like that. And hopefully what people find a non-judgmental way. So yeah, I'd say on there. I'm also on Thatch under the same name if anyone wants any sustainable travel guides. And yeah, that's about it.
Okay, I'll make sure to link those in the show notes. And yeah, thank you so much for your time today.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed our talk. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to the Got a Case of Wanderlust podcast. Again, my name is Lydia, and you can find me on social media in the About section of this podcast. Please rate and review if you found value or insight from this, and I hope to see you in the next episode.